Hey guys, so we are back this week with chapter 2 called The Biological Perspectives of Adoptee Adjustments by Remi J. Cordet. Again, this will be a relatively longer read because of how long these chapters are, which is exactly why the next book is going to take a lot longer because I'm breaking it up into smaller pieces. But let's get started. Human behavior has no lack of apologists and explanations since time immemorial, including such diverse explanatory schemes on phrenology and astrology. Scientists' explanations of the vagaries of human character have been more recent additions to a long list of whys of behavior. Toward the end of the last century, there was an organized effort to study factors influencing personality and human abilities, with the avowed goal of using this information to improve the race. The eugenic movement, as it has come to be called, stemmed largely from the life work of a British genius, Sir Francis Galton. Galton, whose life spanned almost a century from 1822 to 1911, was fascinated by the tremendous individual variation found in human social status, intellectual abilities, and temperament. He conceived two categories of factors responsible for this variation: nature, or what was physically inherited from parents through the procreative process, and nurture, aka nature versus nurture, right? Or what was transmitted through cultural upbringing and other environmental conditions. In order to measure nature and nurture, Galton devised ingenious techniques used today in the study of inheritance. These approaches include the family study, the twin method, and statistical devices such as regression. Using these techniques, Galton came to the conclusion that nature was more important than nurture, where human abilities, social success, and temperament were concerned. In 1875, in History of Twins, as a criterion of the relative powers of nature and nurture, he wrote, "There is no escape from the conclusion and that nature prevails enormously over nurture. When the difference is nurture do not succeed what is commonly to be found among persons of the same rank of society in the same country. My only fear is that my evidence seems to prove too much, and may be discredited on that account, as it seems contrary to all expectation that nurture should go for so little. But experience is often fallacious in cribbing great effects to trying circumstances. Many a person has amused himself by throwing bits of stick into a brook and watching the progress, how they are arrested first by one chance obstacle, then by another, and again, how their onward course is facilitated by a combination of circumstances. He might ascribe much importance to each of these events, and think how largely the destiny of the stick has been governed by a series of trifling accidents. Nevertheless, all the sticks succeed in passing down the current, and they travel in the long run at nearly the same rate. So it is with life in respect to the several accidents which seem to have had great effect upon our careers. The one element which varies in different individuals but is constant for each of them is the natural tendency. It corresponds to the current in the stream, and inevitability asserts itself. And this is from Pearson's 1914 book on page 8. In one way, Galton foresaw how adoptees could help in sorting out the relative importance of nature or nurture. In his wide-ranging search for evidence on this point, he cited an example of adoption in nature. Consider the cuckoo, he stated, which is raised exclusively by foster parents. The mother cuckoo lays her eggs in other species' nests and leaves it to be hatched and reared by an alien parent. Neither its song, habits, or sympathies are influenced by those of its foster parents. Since Galton's time, there have been a lively debate and frequent acrimony as to the relative importance of nature or nurture. This debate continues to the present, especially with regard to the heritability of IQ, according to Luton, Rose, and Kammen's 1986 study, as well as Scar's 1981 study. Over the years, debate has focused at times on the importance of nature to the exclusion of nurture, or at other periods has focused on nurture to the exclusion of nature. In part, theoretical positions prescribed by such disciplines as psychodynamic psychiatry led to one-sided assessments in the nature-nurture controversy, according to Cordet in his 1986 study. However, in recent years, there have been more reliance on empirical studies rather than theoretical positions, so that a more balanced view of nature and nurture is emerging. Many of these empirical study designs, oh my god, I just lost my place. One of the most empirical study designs used today date back to the time of Galton. One of the earliest was developed by Galton himself, the family study. In this approach, pedigrees were prepared of families, starting with the proband of member of a family with a behavior of interest, like alcohol abuse. When classical genetics came into the picture in the early years of the century, the pedigree was studied to see if the pattern of transmission followed known genetic mechanisms, such as the dominant gene transmission seen in Huntington's chorea. The family study was also used to determine whether the familial transmission of behavior occurred. Pedigrees of families selected on the basis of certain programmed behaviors were compared to control families selected by matching probands without the behavior in question. If the incidence of relatives with the target behavior is higher in the proband families than the control, then familial transmission is demonstrated. For example, studies of families of alcoholics almost invariably show higher rates of alcoholism in relatives than are found in relatives of control probands, Cotton's study in 1979. The difference could be due to genetic or environmental factors. The family study merely indicates that one or the other or both factors are likely involved. In order to isolate and measure separately the effects of genes from those of the environment, special techniques have been developed. The oldest, again introduced by Francis Galton, is the comparison of monozygotic with dizygotic twin pairs. Oh, there's a lot of big words in this. I'm not gonna lie. Since monozygotic twins share the same genes, but dizygotic only have half their genes in common. So I think what they're saying, if I'm not mistaken, and I could totally be, is monozygotic are like fertile, identical twins, if that makes sense. I think that's what they're called. But of course, they're using scientific words. Okay. Since monozygotic twins share the same genes, but dizygotic only have their genes in common, differences in coordinates for behaviors reflect this genetic difference. Twin studies have been and remain very important tool in delineating the importance of genetic and environmental variables in determining human behavior. All right, pausing right there. That is true. I'm going to cover some twin studies when it comes to adoption because it's incredibly sad what some of these studies have done. But to prove nurture versus nature, they actually did this where it was both twins and triplets, where they actually split them up to different adoptive families, not telling them that there were more babies, to see how they reacted. Now, the adoptive parents did not know that they were part of a study, nor did biological parents. It was the doctors involved / agency that did this study on their own, and it was deemed highly inhumane and unethical. So you can see where that's going to go. But yeah, I mean, studies on twins have been used in nurture versus nature for a while. All right. Anyway, let's continue. In order to separate further the effects of genes from those of the environment, studies have been done on twins separated early in life. The separation design has been used most effectively in the case of adoptees. The natural prototype of this design in the case of nature, where an individual from one species is raised by the member of a different species, such as seen in the example of the cuckoo. The use of human adoptees to separate nature from nurture was first suggested by L.F. Richardson between the years of 1912 and 1913. During the early decades of the first century, interest in adoptees first centered around the question of nature and nurture in human intelligence, which was stimulated in part by the development at the time of tests to measure intelligence. The adoption strategy involved a study of adoptees, their biological parents, and their adoptive parents. As adoptions developed in the early years of this century, children generally separated at birth from biological parents and their birth environment were placed with non-relatives who legally adopted and raised their children. In nature-nurture studies, the focus of the investigation was usually a trait, behavior, or other characteristics. As in the early studies during the teens and 20s of this century, when the focus was on intelligence, the crux of the technique involves comparisons between adoptees and both sets of parents, biological and adoptive. The resemblance in behavior between adopted children and their biological parents estimated the genetic aspects of inheritance, while the resemblance between adopted children and their adoptive parents or some other aspect of their adoptive environment measured environmental transmission, as well as seen later in this chapter. This technique has been applied to a wide variety of human behaviors, ranging from intelligence to psychopathology. Recently, mathematical models are being increasingly used in human inheritance to measure the relative importance of genes, environment, and the interaction of the two. Some of the modeling designed to show whether a trait is inherited by dominant recessive or multigenetic transmission. And this was from a study in 1979. With other types of statistical models, it is possible to measure the interaction of genetic factors with those of the environment. And that's according to a 1977 study. Gene-environment interaction is a potentially important factor in behavior, according to Cadorey and Kane in 1982. Interaction is the process whereby certain environments markedly enhance or decrease the likelihood of certain genetically determined behaviors, significantly more so than would be expected if the genetic factors and the environmental factors acted independently. Such as finding in human behavior has been reported by the author, who found that adoptees from an antisocial biological background when placed in adoptive homes, where another family member had a psychiatric or behavior disturbance, demonstrated far higher numbers than expected of different antisocial behaviors in adolescence, according to Cadorey in 1985 and a 1982 study. Gene-environment interaction, therefore, is of considerable importance to the adoption process. If there are environments in which genetically determined behaviors are markedly enhanced or markedly diminished, then the selective placement of adoptees in adoptive homes could affect dramatically the manifestations of these behaviors. In the past, it has not been the practice to use information about gene-environment interaction and adoption placement decisions, but as far more facts are available for specific behaviors, this practice might become more important. More recent developments in the field of genetics have led to additional powerful techniques to determine the involvement of genes in behavior and even to determine where on a particular chromosome a gene encoding of behavioral abnormality might be located. For a number of years, a technique known as linkage analysis has been used by geneticists to demonstrate that a particular behavior has a genetic basis. In linkage analysis, a trait known to be genetic, such as a blood group, blood serum, or a protein, for example, is traced through a family pedigree and its appearance with a target behavior noted. If the gene is causing the trait, known as the marker, is located physically close to the gene causing the target behavior, the marker and the behavior will segregate or travel together, so that the marker and the behavior will occur in the same individual and be transmitted to offspring in predictable ways. Conversely, if the marker is physically far away from the behavioral gene, even though on the same chromosome, they will not segregate together because of chromosome exchanges. During the reproductive process, of course, if the gene responsible for behavior and the marker gene are on totally different chromosomes, then linkage cannot occur and a different marker must be sought. In the past, there are not enough markers to cover adequately all the areas of all the chromosomes in humans. However, the recent developments in molecular genetics, an almost limitless number of markers may be developed. These are called probes, and with them it is possible to examine at present almost the entire range of human chromosomes for genetic linkage, according to Little in 1986. Already, the location of one serious behavioral manifested illness, Huntington's chorea, has been accomplished with this technique, according to a study in 1983 and 1986. While linkage can establish that a behavior has a genetic factor, the technique cannot determine the influence of environment. Other types of studies, such as adoption designs, are needed for this. In the future, however, the use of such markers will be invaluable for genetic counseling, since it is possible to identify individuals who carry genes that causes behavioral abnormalities and to predict within limits the transmission of these genes to offspring. But for the present, genetic counseling for many behavioral conditions must be more tentative and much less exact. It is apparent from a large number of studies of twins and adoptees that behavior ranging from personality traits and intelligence to psychopathology, such as substance abuse and manic depressive disorder, have at their base a genetic factor. Nuremberg, Golden, and Gershon 1986 study proved that. Obviously, many of these genetic factors are important detriments of adoptee behavior, and explanations of adoptee adjustment must be taken into account. In the past, environmental factors have been studied extensively in adoptee adjustment, almost to the exclusion of genetic factors. For example, a review of adoption research in the UK, US, and Canada between the years 1948 and 1965, comprising of 51 abstracts and 302 other references, contains no study which relates adoptee psychopathology or adjustment problem to biological parent characteristics, according to Pringle in 1967. Instead, environmental factors such as adoptive parent attitudes were closely examined as an exclusive factor in adoptee adjustment. Several studies from this period will illustrate this preoccupation with the environment. Nemovitcher in 1960 reported that adopted boys were more hostile, tense, dependent, and fearful than non-adopted boys, and concluded that the adoptive parents' feelings about sterility and their over-concern with achievement contributed importantly to the adoptee's personality, otherwise known as the biological background, was not examined. In another study, Towsend in 1962 reported that 39 adoptees treated at the Menninger Clinic were more likely to show emotional disturbances than non-adopted children. He hypothesized that the adoptive parents' unconscious and unresolved aversion toward parenthood was responsible for the disturbance in the adoptee. Again, genetic factors were not controlled. A third and final example is a study published in 1956, which correlated adoptee childhood aggression with the type of child rearing practices experienced by the adoptive mother. This study reported a positive correlation between adoptee aggression and unsympathetic and harsh child rearing experienced by the adoptive mother. Again, inheritance from biological parents was not controlled. It was not until the mid-1960s, starting with the Hessen's paper on schizophrenia in 1966, that interest swung toward elucidation of genetic factors in adoptee psychopathology, and by the extension to adoptee adjustment. In the 2 decades since 1966, a large number of studies has witnessed the revival of interest in genetic factors. This development will be reviewed in the later sections of this chapter. Most of these studies involve the use of the adoption paradigm described previously and have covered a wide range of behaviors from personality to a number of psychopathological conditions, all of which are relevant to the subject of adoptee adjustment. The work of the last 2 decades with adoptees has also sought evidence for environmental effects as well, and this will be reviewed. All in all, the research record of the past 20 years shows a more balanced approach to the nature-nurture problem, and thus offers potentially more valid results and practical suggestions for adoption professionals. So we are starting with the first section, which is biological factors in adoptee adjustment. There are a large number of characteristics influenced by genetic and environmental causes that affect adoptee adjustment. For many years, agencies placing newborns for adoptions have considered physical features as hair and eye color, which are known to be genetically determined. The object ostensibly was to match adoptees to adoptive parents so that families would not stand out by having obvious biological impossible combinations. For example, bright-eyed children with 2 blue-eyed parents. Body size was another feature sometimes considered since height as well as being influenced by diet is genetically determined. Recent work has shown that obesity is also inherited genetically, according to a 1986 study. and thus represents another physical characteristic which could enter into matching. One study in 1987 found that obese adoptees were more likely to be found in adoptive homes in a rural environment where someone in the home other than the adoptee had a behavioral problem. But it is the behavioral characteristics of individuals that are the main determinants of adjustment. These characteristics encompass such areas of behavior as temperament, personality, intellect, and marked deviance from norm in behavior known as personality disorders, and psychopathology such as major depression, panic disorder, and schizophrenia. The remainder of the chapter will discuss these characteristics in psychopathology behaviors and their genetic and environmental roots based for the most part on the actual data from the studies of adoptees, particularly all of the adoption studies whose results are vis-a-vis nature versus nurture, which will be reported in the following sections, are of two design types. In one, the starting point is selection of a proband adoptee with behavior of interest such as drug abuse, and a suitable control adoptee such as one without the trait of behavior of interest. Okay, I'm going to pause right here. I'm going to find this extremely problematic because I know this was done a while back. The issue is that people turn to drugs and alcohol abuse generally to get away from their trauma. It's their escapism. It's their way of coping. Now, I'm not saying it's okay to do that. Of course not. But to say someone chooses, maybe they tried it and there is an addiction gene that is now known, and they just get addicted, right? So, like, we talk about alcoholism that has run through families and being careful about how you drink, right? So oftentimes you'll see generational trauma continue through alcoholism or drug abuse or the way that your parents discipline. Those are just some features that are problematic. So for them to use the use of drug abuse and not recognize the trauma portion of it, I find is problematic. But we will continue on and see what they have to say. From the starting point, one identifies biological and adoptive parents and determines the presence of the trait interest in both sets of parents. If the biological parents of the adoptee have a higher incidence of the trait or behavior, like drug abuse, than the adoptive parents, then all other factors being equal, that is considered evidence for a genetic factor. As an example of this design is Skollesinger's 1977 report on inheritance of sociopathy. All right, again, with the drug abuse with biological parents, I know that a lot of society likes to use, your parents were alcoholics or your parents were drug abusers, which, by the way, less than 4% of adoptees' parents were, at the time of their birth. And again, I'm not saying that they don't deserve a chance to parent or they don't deserve a chance to overcome it. But for those that were not drug abusers or not alcoholics at the time, and then may have turned that way, it is, again, due to trauma. So we have to be able to recognize that. And I'm not sure this study is efficient enough with that. I feel like they're just kind of glossing over that. But again, this was done in the 1960s and 70s. So even recognizing that alcohol abuse was a thing for the most part was extremely rare. It was very common for parents to come home and drink every night and not recognize it as alcohol abuse. So it's just a whole other level. All right. In the second type of adoption design, the starting point is the biological parent, for example, one with a trait of behavior of interest, and a suitable control parent without the trait. The adopted away offspring are then identified and studied for evidence of the trait. The adoptive home environment can be studied as well and correlated with the adoptee outcome. In the second type of design, the sample of adoptees is not selected for the trait or behavior of interest, as in the first design. Hence, correlations of behaviors with each other and with environments within the sample might be expected to be more representative of those occurring in the general population. This is an important consideration in assessing factors relevant to adoptee adjustment. If adoptees are selected on the basis of some adjustment problem, like antisocial behavior, such samples usually come from treated or otherwise identified samples. However, treatment might depend on a host of environmental factors as well as other behaviors in an adoptee proband. These factors for selection of a proband could then lead to spurious identification of environmental factors important to the adoptee behavior of interest. Fortunately, this error is minimized in the second type of adoption design, and most of the adoption studies which have been identified environmental factors have used this design, included the Collinger, Bowman, and Sigvardsson 1981 study of alcohol abuse in men. While many of these studies demonstrate the importance of genetic and environmental factors in diverse behaviors, they do not allow us to estimate how many adoptees in the population will be considered disturbed. For the estimate, we would require more information about the genetic makeup of biological parents. This type of information about biological parents is not readily available. Though one study of unwed pregnant mothers, the largest source of babies for adoption in North America, showed that they had significant elevations of 5 of 9 clinical MMPI scales, which compared to when compared to married pregnant women, according to Horn in 1975. This study would suggest that if conditions leading to scale elevations are heritable, then adoptees should show higher levels of mental illness than the general population. Other factors being equal, far better would be a direct estimate of behaviors in adoptees from studies of individuals randomly sampled from the population. Thus, the adoption study is, as defined above, can identify both genetic and environmental factors important in behavior. The following sections will present the evidence for the importance of nature and nurture in a wide variety of behaviors relevant to an individual's adjustment in society. So we're going to start off with temperament and personality. Temperament has been recently defined as those dimensions of personality that are largely genetic or constitutional in origin, exist in most ages and in most societies, show some consistency across situations that are relatively stable, at least within major developmental areas. Plomin's 1981 study. Temperament research has been focused extensively on young children. The most well-known research in temperament is the work of Thomas and Chess in 1977. They have postulated 9 dimensions of temperament, such as activity level, rhythmicity, intensity of reaction, quality of mood, to name a few. Combinations of these factors make up clinical types such as the slow to warm up or the difficult child. The latter is characterized by intense reactions, negative mood, and lack of rhythmicity and unpredictable daily schedule. Unfortunately, there is no direct evidence suggesting the heritability of the Chess-Thomas temperament constructs. Another more recent theory defines temperament as genetically influenced traits which appear early in life, such as Buss and Plomin's 1984 study. These theorists propose emotionality, activity, and sociability as 3 traits meeting these criteria. These conclusions are almost entirely based on twin studies and should be confirmed in adoption studies. A recent longitudinal study of adopted children, according to the Colorado Adoption Project, may help settle this question from Plomel and DeFries 1985. Preliminary results from the first 2 years of the adoptee's life indicate that adoptive parents' personality has little power to predict infant temperament. However, there is some evidence, according to Plomin's and DeFries' 1985 study on page 233, that the genotype of the child might react to the environmental factors in the adoptee's home, indicating that adoptive parents are likely responding or reacting to the genetic makeup of the child. Similarly, little evidence was found for the effect of deviant adoptive parent behaviors, like depression, sociopathy, and hysteria, on variants of adoptee behaviors such as feeding, diapering, or difficult temperament, according to Plomin and DeFries 1985 in Chapter 11. With regard to personality manifestations later in life, adoptee studies generally indicate modest positive correlations between biological parents and adopted away children, but almost no correlation between adoptive parents and their adoptee, according to a 1985 study. Extroversion, introversion, appears to be one dimension of adult personality that there is substantial evidence of genetic inheritance, according to a 1985 study. The major finding in most studies is that shared environment contributes very little to adult personality characteristics. However, genetic effects, while demonstrable, do not appear to be all-controlling, and other factors such as special unique experiences or gene-environment interaction might figure significantly in personality development. In view of the early state of knowledge about genetics and personality and temperament, it would appear to be reasonable to question the applicability of this information to practical questions about adoptive placement. If, for example, it could be shown that children from extroverted biological parents did poorly when placed with introverted adoptive parents, then personality genetics would be an important consideration in adoptive placement. We must await the outcome of current longitudinal adoption studies, such as the Colorado Adoption Project, to answer such questions. So I think I'm going to try to find this project and look it up to do a video for you guys and see what they have to say. Try to take some of these studies. It might take me a while, but it'll help if you guys, like and subscribe so you guys can keep in tune. All right, we're going to continue on with the intelligence portion of this chapter. So now we are talking about the intelligence portion. In the nature-nurture arena, no question has generated more polemic and heat than the heritability of IQ, according to Luton's 1986 study. It is ironic that the question is not better settled since the issue has been investigated with adoption studies for 2 generations. Interest in heritability of human intellectual abilities was one of the main investigations sponsored by the early eugenic movement. From 1922 to the present, there have been a series of published reports using adoptees. These reports are summarized in Messenger's 1975 study and support the importance of genetic factors in intelligence. More recent reports are still appearing, studies by Horn in 1983, Pullman and DeFries 1985, and Scars 1981, which all deal with IQ as well as development of cognitive styles. Findings in IQ studies generally support the genetic heritability of IQ but demonstrate less evidence for the environmental effects. However, the best known IQ study from the past done by Skodek and Skills in their 1936, 1938, 1966, 1939, and 1949 studies showed that in addition to genetic effect on IQ, that in a proper environment, low IQ scores could be improved over time. Although the effect of the environment was likely to be overestimated by the environmental design, according to Messenger's 1975 study. It did show the ability of adoption studies to pick up environmental as well as genetic factors. Despite the polemic over IQ, it is very likely that a large proportion of variability in human intelligence is affected by genetic factors. This fact is reflected in the human intelligence is affected by genetic factors. This fact is reflected, This fact is reflected in the widespread adoption practice of placement that is based on expectations of the child's potential in the decisions as to what type of adoptive home is suitable were largely based on IQ estimates of the adoptee, in addition to consideration of socioeconomic backgrounds of both the child and the eventual adoptive family. Psychopathology. There is no question that adoptee adjustment is reflected in a wide range of psychopathologies. Many very common psychiatric conditions, such as depression, have genetic factors in their etiology. The remaining section of this chapter will deal with the important psychiatric problems, which are in part genetically determined and often environmentally as well, and thus might be considered an adoptive placement. In the sections on psychopathology, which follow psychiatric conditions, will be described in accordance with the diagnostic criteria set forth in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also known as DSM, and this was the 3rd edition of the American Psychiatric Association. So the first part is the antisocial personality. Antisocial personality is strongly associated with conditions such as delinquency and criminality. Many adolescents and younger children with conduct disorders become antisocial adults. The antisocial personality shows chronic and recurrent disturbances in social behavior prior to age 15. Such individuals demonstrate truancy and other problems such as fighting, run away from home, persistent lying, early use of drugs or alcohol, stealing, vandalism, and chronic violation of school and home rules. Following the age of 18, such individuals also demonstrate an inability to sustain consistent work, are often unable to function as a responsible parent, frequently are involved with the law in the commission of serious crimes such as felonies, continue to be irritable and aggressive, leading to physical fights or assault, are often financially irresponsible, impulsive, and frequently con others. Pursuing the kinds of activities noted above frequently leads these individuals to be declared either delinquent or adolescents or criminal as adults. However, it must be recognized that the terms delinquency and criminal are judgments imposed by the social system, and that there are many individuals as adjudged who are not themselves antisocial personalities. Thus, the terms antisocial, delinquent, and criminal are not interchangeable, although there is an extremely high correlation among them. Adoption studies have been done with both antisocial personality and criminality as outcome variables. Two groups of investigators have shown significant genetic factors in criminality. Mednick and colleagues, in their 1977 and 1984 studies working in Denmark, have shown a high correlation between biological parents who are criminals and criminality in adopted away children. Bowman and coworkers from Sweden in their there's three 1982 studies, have also shown significant genetic factors in criminality. Crow's 1974 work in the U.S. with the adopted away offspring of female felons, most of whom were likely antisocial personalities, found a significant increase in incidence of antisocial personality among their offspring when compared to control sample of adoptees who did not come from an antisocial background. Crow also found some possible environmental effect in that adoptees who at an early age were exposed to an adverse environment such as divorce and separation in the adoptive home were more likely to be antisocial as adults. Another Scandinavian author, Scholsinger, in his 1977 study, has shown an increase of personality disorders, including the antisocial, among the biological parents. Of personality disordered adoptees. Cordet has reported several studies in which offspring of biological parents with antisocial behaviors were compared to adopted away offspring of control parents, and has found a higher incidence of antisocial personality diagnosis in the offspring of the biological parents who had demonstrated antisocial behaviors, according to his 1978 and 1985 study. In one study by Cordet, in his 1987 study, showed that certain environmental factors also increased the chance of an adoptee being antisocial. These factors involved psychiatric disturbance of some type occurring in other members of the adoptive family, especially antisocial behaviors. While there are no studies describing delinquency as an outcome, Cadorey has investigated antisocial behaviors in adolescents, many of whom had been judged delinquent, and found again that an antisocial biological parent predicted significantly higher rates of adolescent antisocial behaviors in his 1985, 1981, and 1982 studies. Evidence of gene-environment interaction was also found in that several environmental conditions which increase the number of antisocial behaviors during adolescence, when discovered in combination with antisocial biological parents, produced much higher rates of adolescent antisocial behavior than expected if each factored act independently. And that's again according to his 1985 and 1982 studies. In general, the environment effect was the presence in the adoptive home of another family member with some kind of psychiatric or behavioral problem. Because of its genetic factor, as well as the evidence for environmental effect, antisocial personality is a very important consideration in adoption practice. Its importance arises not only because of the long-term nature of the condition that causes high amounts of social incapacity and disturbance, but also lies in the fact that many parents who give up children for adoption demonstrate considerable antisocial behaviors, and many are undoubtedly diagnosable as antisocial personalities. In the author's own work, with 4 different adoption agencies over the past 15 years, the commonest psychopathological condition found among biological parents giving up children for adoption has been antisocial behavior or antisocial personality. Again, that is from Cordet's 1985, 1987, and 1975 studies. Knowledge of environmental factors that enter into the equation of adoptee adjustment can lead to selective placement in which homes are picked for adopted away children from high-risk antisocial backgrounds where there is no evidence of psychiatric or behavioral disturbance in family members. Information that the antisocial condition in genetically transmitted might enable early diagnosis to be made and treatment instituted. Okay, so basically what they're saying is that, with the nature versus nurture, people assume that if you nurture enough, adoptive parents always say, well, if I love enough, this is not my child, right? But that's not true because there's always these genetic factors. Now, that's also not to say that, well, actually does say that there is someone in the home that has these behavioral issues. Now, I'm going to speculate here as an adoptee, and with all the information that I've had, is that it's often the adoptive mother that has these issues, and I'm saying often. Now, that's not to say that they, it could not be, right? It could be a sibling that's in the home. It could be the father. It could be someone that they're exposed to. But as that part just said, it also increases if there is divorce or separation. So there's definitely an environmental impact, but it is mainly genetic, right? So we have to keep that in mind, that our brains are still wired for trauma, and no amount of love can undo that trauma, right? No amount of working, and I say this in the best possible way. When it comes to adoption trauma, that's never going to go away, right? It's always going to be there. It's not like other types of trauma where you can work through it and it kind of just, okay, doesn't bother you, right? But this is one of those traumas where we had no choice. Our brains are completely wired since birth for most of us on this incident. Like, that's what we've been talking about, right? Or we're going to talk way more about it in the future as well. So we have to be aware of that. Anyway, moving on. We're going to talk about alcohol and drug abuse. Substance abuse has become one of the leading social problems of our time, especially with increasing use of illegal drugs by youth, such as alcohol, drug abuse, and according to the Alcohol, Drug Abuse, and Mental Health Administration in 1986. Alcohol or drug abuse can be characterized by the following behaviors. There is usually a pattern of pathological alcohol use of evidenced by the daily use of alcohol and an inability to cut down or stop, which leads to binges. Pathological substance use is also evidenced by continuation of drinking or drug use despite serious physical disorders associated by their use. The heavy use of alcohol or drugs generally leads to marked impairment in social or occupational functioning, manifested by fighting legal difficulties such as public intoxication or drunk driving charges, and poor job performance. Should alcohol or drug use reach a certain level, then physical dependence can occur as shown by tolerance. A need for marked increased amounts of the drug or alcohol to achieve a desired effect. Dependence is also associated with the withdrawal symptoms, physical or psychological symptoms which occur in response to abstinence. Obviously, these behaviors cause a great deal of social disturbance, including perpetration of crimes for the purpose of getting money for drugs or alcohol. Thus, many crimes are committed under the influence of drugs and alcohol, as well as other self-destructive acts such as unaliving themselves. In the last decade, adoption studies have confirmed that alcohol abuse has a genetic factor. Prior to this, one study done in 1944 failed to show a significant genetic or environmental element in transmission of alcohol abuse, according to Rose, 1944. Starting in 1973, however, Goodwin and Associates, in their 1973 study, have provided evidence that there is a genetic factor in alcohol abuse in a group of adopted away Danish sons of alcoholics. By comparing alcoholism rates in adopted away sons with siblings who were not adopted out, these investigators also looked for an environmental effect but failed to find one. And Bowman and co-workers in Sweden have also described genetic and environmental factors operating in alcohol abuse. And that's according to his 1983 and two 1981 studies. These investigators have suggested that there are several types of alcoholism, some with genetic factors more important and others more affected by environmental factors. And that's according to Claude Inger 1981 study. They also described similar genetic and environmental factors operating in female adoptees as well as in males, according to Bowman's 1981 study. In the United States, Cadorey has also found evidence for genetic factors in the transmission of alcohol abuse in his 1978, 1985, and 1987 study. Both male and female adoptees seem to follow the same pattern of inheritance. Cadorey also described an environmental factor that increased the rate of alcoholism in adoptees, having some other adoptive family member with an alcohol problem. And that's according to his 1985 and 1987 study. Substance abuse is generally highly correlated with antisocial personality. The Bowman study cited above takes this fact into consideration, and the author has described types of alcoholism strongly associated with criminality, and that's in his 1982 study. Cadorey has also found significant relationships between antisocial and alcohol abuse, and that is again in his 1985 and 1987 study. However, even controlling for the fact that an individual is antisocial, there is still a strong genetic effect with an alcoholic biological background, predicting increased alcohol abuse in adoptees. There is no evidence for significant gene-environment interaction in these studies that found environmental and genetic effects in alcohol abuse. Drug abuse is also strongly correlated with antisocial personality. A recent study of adoptees who were drug abusers demonstrated this fact, according to Cadorey's 1986 study. This study described several possible routes to drug abuse, one through antisocial personality and another occurring in individuals with who themselves were not antisocial, but who came from biological parents with an alcoholic problem. In the same study, several environmental factors increased the chance of an adoptee being a drug abuser. One of these was having an adoptive parent who was psychiatrically or behaviorally disturbed, including divorce or separation. Interestingly, these environmental factors appear to be different from the ones leading to increased alcohol abuse, which, as noted above, were having a family member with a drinking problem. Obviously, there's a great deal of human misery associated with substance abuse of any kind, and any measures which can be taken to avoid this complication should be taken. Since there's evidence for genetic element in alcohol abuse and possibly in drug abuse, there are important elements to consider in adoptive placement. Again, as with antisocial personality, alcohol abuse frequently occurs in biological parents who gave up children for adoption. So the risk of these conditions in adoption is quite high. These studies above would indicate that given a biological background of alcoholism, the chance of abuse in offspring is 4 to 6 times higher than if the offspring did not have this genetic factor in the background. All right, pausing there. We're going to talk about this. So, as stated, we're 4 to 6 times more likely to have this genetic portion of the alcohol or, the alcohol or drug abuse. But I do want to say in that first part of the paragraph, they stated human misery, aka trauma. So it's not taking nearly as much into effect of the trauma of the biological parents, right? So whether that is before the relinquishment of the child, where maybe there is generational trauma, maybe their parents, so the grandparents of the adoptee did things to their parents, because especially back then there was a lot of harm being done. But also, it doesn't take in effect the aftermath of the relinquishment, which again is trauma, and that many people, whether adopted or not, turn to alcohol or drugs to numb themselves, right? And, well, we're not saying that that's a good thing, obviously. What we're saying is that they're not taking nearly enough of that portion of it into account. So while genetically we may be 4 to 6 times more likely because of, our biological parents, we're also 4.7 times more likely to turn to drug and alcohol abuse just because of the adoption trauma. All right, so there is a lot more there that people don't realize. So I want to make that clear that it's just not taking nearly enough. Now, granted, this is an older book, but, while I appreciate what these psychologists, social workers, etc., are trying to do with all the studies, some of them are just too vague in a sense. Anyway, we're going to continue on. Affective disorders, known as depression and mania. Affective disorders disorders comprised of depression and mania are probably the commonest psychiatric symptoms, with depression being far more common than mania, according to Wicknucker in 1969. Depression is characterized by a cluster or syndrome of symptoms consisting of appetite disturbance, sleep disturbance, agitation, I'm not going to say that word, mental not fully being there, smartness, in movement and thinking. Loss of interest in activities usually enjoyed, decreased in energy, feelings of guilt, or depreciation, decreased ability to concentrate, and morbid thoughts about death or illness, including suicide and death wishes. This syndrome usually lasts for a number of weeks, and the illness is an episode one with a complete remission of symptoms being the more usual course, but with the reoccurrence of some later time being a definite possibility in some cases. If an individual has only depression, this is known as the unipolar illness. As mentioned above, a small number of individuals with depressive illness also have episodes of mania and are said to have bipolar illness. Mania is characterized by a syndrome lasting for several weeks of euphoric mood, hyperactivity, speeded up activity such as push of speech, and rapid sequence of experienced ideas, grandiose mood, decreased need for sleep, and an excessive involvement of potentially disastrous social activities. In the view of equity of depression, it is ironic that there have been relatively few adoption studies of this condition. The most positive correlation was reported by Mendelowitz and Rayner in 1977, who followed up the offspring of individuals who had mania and depression, so also known as bipolar illness, and found strong evidence for a genetic factor. It is not certain whether these investigators looked for environmental factors as well. Other evidence from family studies and genetic linkage studies also support the genetic element in the transmission of bipolar, and that's according to Van Erdewa. I don't think I said that right. And Gerson's 1980 study. With regard to transmission of depression alone, the record is less clear. One adoption study reported by Cadorey in 1978 showed a positive correlation between biological parents with affective disorder and depression in their adopted away offspring. This finding, however, was in a very small sample and later reported again by Cadorey's 1985, found little evidence for a genetic factor when the same sample was enlarged. But the latter study did report a number of environmental factors for both males and females that increase the chance of depression occurring in adopted away children. These factors were, for males, placement in a home where an adoptive family member had a drinking problem, and for females, placement in a home where another individual had a behavioral problem or where the home was broken up by death or divorce. Adoptees exposed to these environmental conditions during childhood and adolescence were more likely to have depression as adults. One other adoption study from Sweden, according to von Noring in 1983, also looked at genetic factors in depression and has failed to find clear-cut evidence for them. However, this study did report that psychiatric disturbance in an adoptive family member was associated with adoptee depression. Thus, the genetic status of transmission of unipolar depression is unclear at this present time. At least some adoption studies, however, the evidence from adoption studies that the environmental factors are involved in depression must be taken seriously in considering placement for children for adoption. All right, so I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to say that I don't think, now, maybe the manic, the bipolar, and other mental disorders could be shown genetically, but I feel like depression is one of those things that there's a lot of factors that come into it. And like I said, I know this book is older, but I just find that they don't really do a good job in that little piece really correlating that depression could be genetic or necessarily associated with adoption per se, if that makes sense. All right, anyway, continuing on. Anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders, such as panic attacks and phobias, are relatively common in the general population. Anxiety or panic disorders is characterized by discrete panic attacks. By the way, anxiety disorders are way more, but we're going to talk about that in a second, in which an individual experiences heart palpitations, chest pain, or discomfort, difficulty with breathing, including choking or smothering sensations, symptoms of dizziness or unsteadiness, tingling in hands or feet, sweating, and faintness. All right, so it could also be like you have gastro problems, like going to the bathroom, sometimes like disassociation. I mean, there's a lot more with the anxiety portion, but they're specifically talking panic attacks, but you don't necessarily have a panic attack if you have anxiety. So I just want to make that clear. Individuals sometimes tremble or shake and are consumed with an overwhelming fear of dying, of losing their mind, or of doing something shameful, criminal, or bizarre during an attack. Some individuals have, in addition to panic attacks, a fear of going out or being in certain situations. These individuals are known as agoraphobics. There are a number of family studies which indicate that panic disorder and agoraphobia are certainly transmitted in families, according to Crow's 1983 study. Unfortunately, there is no evidence from adoption studies regarding genetic transmission of these conditions, but twin studies indicate a genetic factor, according to Torgeson's 1983. The importance of environmental factors is not clear. Okay, so yeah. Anxiety is quite common, so just, that's pretty much what they were saying. Now, we're going to talk about schizophrenia and related disorders. Schizophrenia is usually a severe chronic psychiatric illness characterized by long-term disability and deterioration of personality, especially in the area of motivation. Individuals with this illness generally have a prominent delusions of various types, with the commonest involving a persecutory themes. These individuals also have auditory hallucinations and sometimes visual hallucinations. There is also in many sufferers marked difficulty with thinking, so that the concentration is impaired and coherent trains of thoughts and rational reason are difficult, if not impossible. Because of the seriousness of the condition and the chronicity, the illness amounts for a high proportion of psychiatric hospitalizations and results in long-term disability. These studies have reported evidence for genetic factors in schizophrenia. One of these is Heston's 1966 study, which reported on the adopted away offspring of hospitalized schizophrenic women. He found that a higher proportion of these adopted away offspring had schizophrenia than a comparison group of offspring from non-schizophrenic women. Although Heston sought environmental factors such as social class, none were found. The second study to report positive evidence for a genetic factor in schizophrenia is from Denmark, and an extensive collaboration study by Kitty Rosenthal there's more than one doctor, 1971, 1978, 1968, another 1971, and 1974 study. This study also found an increased schizophrenic illness among the offspring of separated away adoptees of schizophrenic parentage. A number of studies have been done with Danish adoption data in order to elucidate the role of environmental factors, but little evidence of environmental influences such as psychopathology in adoptive parents, poor child-parent relations, or abnormal psychometric test results in parents has been found. And again, that is by some of the same studies. In a further analysis of the same data, Kinney and Jacobsons in their 1978 report that postnatal cerebral injury, season of birth, and socio-familial factors were implicated as environmental effects leading to schizophrenia. Personality traits in adoptive parents, such as shyness as an adult or lack of spontaneity during a diagnostic interview, were identified as possible social factors. However, the sample size was very small and needs to be replicated. The third adoption study on schizophrenia is currently being conducted in Finland. Recently reported data from this group has found a higher number of psychotic offspring from schizophrenic parents than from control parents, and that is by Cadorey in 1985. This group also reports higher psychopathology in adoptees in adoptive families with severe family relationship disturbances than in healthy adoptive families. And healthy is in quotes, by the way. For a number of years, it has been thought that conditions other than schizophrenia occur more frequently in the families of schizophrenics, according to Rosenthal's 1975 study. This has been shown to be the case of reanalysis of the Danish adoption data by Kindler, Grunberg, and Strauss' 1981 study, who reported that a personality disorder known as oh my god, what in the heck? Sorry, guys. Schizopathol? I've never heard of that. Personality was found more frequently in the adopted away offspring of schizophrenics. Schizotypal personality is characterized by certain bizarre beliefs and behaviors, but without the full panoply of schizophrenic symptoms mentioned above. In addition, this personality disorder, paranoid personality disorder, has also been found frequently in families of schizophrenics in Danish adoption studies. And that's according to Kindler's 1984 study. Paranoid personality is a diagnosis characterized by unwarranted suspicious and distrust of people, including hypersensitivity and hypervigilance against perceived threats, which is exactly what adoptees do from birth. So, okay. And very restricted affective reactions such as emotional coldness. These findings that two types of deviating personality disorders are related to schizophrenia suggest that the spectrum concept of schizophrenia, as proposed by Rosenthal's 1975 study, has some merit and certainly some applicability to adoption practices. Because schizophrenia and other conditions in the schizophrenia spectrum, such as paranoid personality, result in such a chronic and serious illness in offspring, it is important to detect their presence in biological families in the adoption process. In spite of the lack of evidence at the present time of significant environmental effects, it is possible that the work in progress, as with the Finnish adoption studies of schizophrenia, may uncover significant environmental factors that should also be taken into consideration in adoption. All right, we are nearly done with this chapter. It is very, this book is very, very much medical based. So I understand if some of you don't understand some of these wordings, because I know I struggle sometimes. All right. Somatoform disorders. All right. This disorder is characterized by a history of physical symptoms, generally beginning before the age of 30. These symptoms are often not adequately explained by physical disorder or injury and are not side effects of medication or drug use. Symptoms vary widely and involve almost every organ system in the body. They generally cause a patient to seek help from physicians and other healthcare professionals and can lead to a great deal of disability and unnecessary medical tests, medications, and hospitalizations. Individuals with somatization disorder usually have large number of different types of symptoms over their lifetime, such as abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, spells, food intolerances, painful menstruation, severe vomiting during pregnancy, sexual indifference, multiple pain complaints in the back, joints, and extremities, and many symptoms referable to the nervous system, such as trouble swallowing, loss of voice, deafness, blurred vision, blindness, fainting, loss of consciousness, loss of memory, seizures, and convulsions. The incidence of this disorder appears to be somewhat higher in women than in men. Most evidence for genetic transmission of somatoform disorder comes from Swedish studies by Bowman and his group in 1984. There's 1984 studies, who described several types of somatization disorders. Cloninger's 1984 study also reported that both types of this disorder were associated with biological backgrounds of criminality or alcoholism. And that's also according to Bowman's 1984 study. Cordet's 1976 study has found that female adoptees who come from antisocial biological background reports are more somatic symptoms. Backgrounds report more somatic symptoms at adolescence. However, whether such individuals become somatizers as adults is unknown in the present time. Parents adopting from biological backgrounds of individuals with antisocial behaviors might be apprised of the possibility of increased somatic complaints in their adoptees. While these complaints, of course, have to be investigated medically, the possibility that they are part of a somatoform disorder might help in their management. All right, I'm going to pause there. So I've never heard of this disorder, but I am going to say that I've talked about it before, that there's a book called The Body Keeps Score. Now, I don't recommend that book per se because the author is problematic, but there are other books that have the same idea of our body holds on to the trauma, right? So, again, I know this is an older book that we're reading currently, but the idea that your body can hold on can cause a lot of chronic illness. So, for example, I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia and lupus, and those are both chronic illnesses. And with the fibro, it is all in the nervous system. There's a lot of issues with it. Now, could that be because of all the trauma that I faced? Yeah, absolutely. There are definitely things that I try to do to help, working through the trauma, breath work, all of those things. And it does help to a point, right? I'm also on medication to help as well. But it's not, I feel like this disorder that we just talked about is like they're faking it. And that's not true. It's our body's way of releasing our, telling us that there's something going on because of the trauma, right? So I just want to make that clear. Anyway, we're going to continue on. Attention deficit disorder. ADD has been closely linked with hyperactivity. It is a condition that appears early in life and is characterized by motor overactivity, including distractibility, impulsiveness, and inability to concentrate for long periods of time. The condition is important because it appears to be a precursor for later antisocial behavior, according to Hetchman's 1984 study, and is associated later in life with conditions such as low self-esteem and failure to do well socially, as might be expected from the individual's background. Family studies appear to show relationships between precursors of antisocial and alcoholic behaviors in parents, and childhood hyperactivity and attention deficit disorder. And that's according to Cantwell's 1975 study. One adoption study found an increase in hyperactivity in children who came from a variety of disturbed biological backgrounds. That's according to Cunningham's 1975 study. And a later study found that childhood hyperactivity and attention deficit disorder were associated with alcoholic and antisocial biological backgrounds. And that's according to Cadorey's 1980 study. In the latter study, environmental variables such as medical problems arising during pregnancy, labor, and delivery were not found to influence the hyperactivity and attention deficit outcome. Since hyperactivity and attention deficit appear to have serious consequences in regard to adult adjustment, it would be helpful in adoption placement to consider children from biological backgrounds of alcohol abuse or antisocial behavior more liable to demonstrate this type of behavior. Parents so apprised might be able to recognize the condition earlier and institute corrective measures. All right, and we're going to talk about miscellaneous conditions. In the view of the fact that a number of personality traits appear to be transmitted genetically, as well as the fact that antisocial personality, a rather deviant behavior pattern, is also genetically transmitted, it is likely that many other extreme personality deviants could also have a genetic factors at their basis. Certainly, evidence is present that schizopathal and paranoid personality may stem in part from a schizophrenic genetic background, and there's a definite possibility that other currently recognized personality deviants, such as borderline personality and obsessive compulsive personality, might have genetic components as well. All right, so we are on the conclusion portion. The consideration of genetic transmission adds to an important and practical dimension to explanations of many behaviors. The older view that children are a, quote, tabula rasa, unquote, as far as behavior, socialization, and the like are concerned would appear to be invalid. Not that the environment is unimportant, it demonstrably is important, and hopefully with the aid of studies of adoptees, the role of environment as well as genetics in human behavior will continue to be clarified further. An example of adoptee psychological disorders with this newer view of genetics helps clarify is the repeated observations over the years of greater than expected numbers of adolescent adoptees appearing in psychiatric facilities with psychiatric problems in a number of studies reviewed by Simon and Centura, 1966 study. Conduct disorders were the principal reasons for referral. More recent studies have found similar trends, such as Osted's 1978, Fullerton's 1986, Senior and Himadi's 1985, and Work and Anderson's 1971 study. Interpretations of these findings, in addition to the usual concerns about sampling, have usually centered on psychodynamic explanations. For example, Simon and Centura's 1966 posted adoptive parent behaviors that subtly encourage all types of aggressive and destructive behavior, or again tied the acting out behavior of the adoptee identity problems brought on by adoptees' fantasies of the biological parents as bad and abandoning, but nevertheless strongly identifying with these bad parents. To these interpretations, we now add the genetic dimension and ask in how many cases of adoptees who come to clinics are biological parents antisocial, depressed, and so on. Perhaps a large part of the variance in adolescent conduct disorder can be ascribed to biological background. Furthermore, the actual findings with adoptive families suggest that environmental variables such as behavioral or psychiatric problems in other adoptive family members play an important role. This role may be very different from many of the psychodynamic models put forth in the past. Recent writers on this theme have begun to cite genetics as a factor, but unfortunately do not have the data to distinguish between their interpretations. The evidence given above for involvement of genetic factors in many significant human behaviors and deviations therefore raises a very real question for adoption professionals. What biological conditions should be screened and what is to be done with the information? Obviously, more information needs to be collected about biological backgrounds, especially about the biological father, who is often not very involved in the adoption process. The question also arises how this data should be collected practically. Should biological parents be administered structured psychiatric interviews to detect conditions which might be important? And should elaborate family histories of biological backgrounds be obtained, involving gathering information about more distant relatives? Interviews of biological parents can be misleading since failure to discover the presence of a condition such as depression may merely mean that the individual is too young to have developed this illness. Oh my goodness. Non-ascertainment is especially likely to occur with individuals. I just lost my place. Who gave up their children for adoption when they are young, before they have had a chance to develop many of the illnesses that might have a potential for genetic transmission. For this reason, more information about distant relatives would appear to be a partial antidote for the problem of non-ascertainment in biological parents. Similar caveats arise in determining what investigations should be made regarding IQ and personality and temperament as a variable. Again, since biological parents are often very young, they have not had a chance to develop their full potential for personality trait development. It is certainly possible that such traits might change over a person's lifetime. IQ, on the other hand, is more easily determined, although again factors of educational and socioeconomic advantage play a role in obscuring true value. One approach to the problem of assessment of risk from genetic factors might be ascertain conditions which are considerable importance because of chronicity, the frequency of their occurrence, or their severity. Such conditions would certainly include schizophrenia, manic depressive illness, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and antisocial behavior, or personality, Screenings for these conditions are certainly within practical reach at the present time by the use of structured psychiatric interviews and family history inventories mentioned above. The extensive number of conditions in which genetic factors have been found to play a role would appear to require changes in the adoption practice of forming prospective adoptive parents in order for them to make total informed decisions. It would appear essentially that important conditions be screened for and parents advised of their presence in their biological background. While this practice might lead to concern in some parts that a knowledge of a child's biological background might influence the outcome adversely, it should also be kept in mind that such information might prove of even greater benefit in allowing for earlier measures when such are or become available. Application of empirically derived figures to assess the risk of transmission from biological parent to the offspring, as done in genetic counseling, is another practical possibility which could be applied in the adoption process. Environmental factors and their application to adoptions are not so easily solved. For one thing, there does not appear to be as much clear evidence for the type of quality of environmental factors associated with adoption adjustment that can be applied directly to the adoptive parent process or to give adoptive families practical advice. We must note that the fact that although adoptive families are carefully screened, psychiatric problems as well as other studies of life occur many times after the adoption process is completed. And to determine the risk factor of this is almost impossible. However, as more is learned about environmental factors and their interaction with genetic factors, practical application will be more likely. In the future, studies of adoptee adjustment that consider both genetic and environmental factors should add considerable science to the art of adoptee placement as well as the art of raising a child. All right, so that is the end of that chapter. And I just want to say, I know it mostly focused on the genetic portion of it, the biological, the nature versus nurture part. But I find that we're focusing more on the nature, right? Which there's nothing wrong with that. I do think that's needed. But there's, as stated, not nearly enough of the environmental, aka the nurture portion. So while I absolutely think that we need more information from the biological parents on both sides, and it should go back, as many generations as possible, and it should be open to the adoptees, not just with the psychiatric portion, but all these medical things. There needs to be more information because it really does affect us in so many aspects of our life, right? But I also think that there needs to be better screening for external care. So I don't like the term adoption because I am anti-adoption in terms of legal process, right? But adoptive parents are often not screened well enough, right? It's a 3-hour home study. That's it. There's no mandatory medical records. There's no mandatory psychiatric. There's so little screening when it comes to it. There's no demanded education. Now, some agencies will require that, but still some of the what they offer is just, it's all bullshit, to be honest with you guys. So I think there definitely needs to be more on both sides, and it should absolutely be open. But information and education is absolutely key, right? And I would suggest, whether you're genetically disposed to this or not, getting adoption-informed therapy for both the adoptive parents, the biological parents, and the adoptee is necessary. It should be mandated. That's just my opinion. All right, guys, I will see you guys next week for chapter 3.